He stood at the podium and called for peace. He issued statements urging restraint. He told the world Saudi Arabia had always supported a diplomatic solution. He looked like a man trying to stop a war. Behind closed doors, he was trying to start one. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, made multiple secret phone calls to Donald Trump in the weeks before the United States attacked Iran. And in those calls, he wasn't asking for diplomacy. He was pushing for bombs. He was telling the most powerful man on earth that if America didn't strike Iran right now, while its military assets were already in the region, the window would close. That Iran would grow stronger, that the moment would be lost forever. The war that killed hundreds of Iranians, that sent oil prices surging 40%, that closed Dubai International Airport, that fired missiles into Saudi Arabia's own energy facilities. That war has a backstory. And that backstory begins with a prince whispering into a president's ear. If you've been following this conflict and you feel like you're only getting half the picture, you're right. Stick with this until the end. And if this kind of reporting matters to you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This channel covers the stories behind the stories. You deserve to know both. Start with what the world was told. On the surface, Saudi Arabia's position throughout early 2026 was clear and consistent. Public statements from Riyadh emphasized dialogue. Saudi officials called for de-escalation. When Iran and the United States were holding indirect nuclear negotiations in Geneva in late February, Saudi Arabia praised those talks. When Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said a historic agreement was within reach, Saudi Arabia said nothing to contradict him. That was the public face. The private face was completely different. Multiple sources familiar with the conversations confirmed that MBS held several private phone calls with Trump in the weeks before the February 28th strikes. What he said in those calls was the opposite of what his government was saying publicly. He argued that Iran would emerge stronger and more dangerous if Washington chose diplomacy over force. He specifically pointed to the fact that the United States had already assembled the largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He told Trump, in effect, you have the assets in place, you have the moment, and if you don't use it, Iran wins. That argument landed. Trump launched the attacks. And then, days later, the phone calls leaked. Saudi Arabia denied everything immediately. The Saudi government issued a statement saying the kingdom had always supported a peaceful resolution to this conflict, even before it began. But the sources were not anonymous bloggers. They were officials briefed on the conversations. And the reporting came from multiple independent outlets, all citing separate people with direct knowledge of what was discussed. Now understand why Saudi Arabia wanted this war, because the answer is more complicated and more cynical than most people realize. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been regional rivals for decades. The rivalry is religious, political, and territorial. Saudi Arabia is Sunni, Iran is Shia. Both nations have spent billions funding proxy conflicts across the Middle East, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq. Every country that destabilized in the region became a battleground for their competing influence. Iran had also spent years developing the capability to strike Saudi infrastructure. That threat was not theoretical. In 2019, Iranian drones and missiles struck Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais, the heart of the kingdom's energy production. It briefly knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's entire oil output. The Saudis felt that attack viscerally. MBS did not forget. He had watched Iran survive sanction after sanction. He had watched Iran develop increasingly sophisticated missiles. He had watched Iran arm Hezbollah, arm the Houthis who had been striking Saudi cities for years, arm proxies that kept the region unstable in ways that directly threatened Saudi power. He had concluded that Iran, as long as it existed in its current form, was a permanent threat to everything Saudi Arabia was building. And here is the part that rarely gets mentioned. MBS was constructing a new Saudi Arabia. Vision 2030, tourism, NEOM, the megacity, the economic diversification. All of it required stability, foreign investment, and a region that wasn't perpetually on fire. As long as Iran existed as a revolutionary Islamic republic determined to export its ideology and armed proxies across the Arab world, that stability was impossible. So MBS made a calculation, not a moral one, a strategic one. He decided the only solution was to use American military power to end the threat permanently. And he had the access to make that case directly to the man who could do it. Here is what the phone calls reportedly contained. Walk through this carefully because every detail matters. MBS's core argument was economic as much as military. He told Trump that any spike in oil prices from a war with Iran would be temporary. He framed the short-term disruption as an acceptable cost for permanent strategic gain. He was essentially telling the American president, don't let the headlines about gas prices scare you. This is a long game. Win it now. He also told Trump that the United States should consider striking Iran's energy infrastructure to financially cripple cripple the regime. This was significant. It wasn't just a call for airstrikes on military sites. MBS was reportedly pushing for economic warfare designed to drain the Iranian government of the revenue it needed to fund its military and its proxies. Then came the most extraordinary part. MBS reportedly argued that Trump should consider putting American troops on the ground inside Iran, not to occupy the country, but to physically seize Iran's energy infrastructure and force the government out of power. The Saudi crown prince was pushing an American president toward regime change in Iran, the very thing the United States had officially stated was not its objective. He also told Trump to keep hitting the Iranians hard. That phrase was reported by multiple outlets, not a nuanced diplomatic suggestion, a direct instruction: keep hitting them hard. Meanwhile, Khalid bin Salman, MBS's brother and Saudi Arabia's defense minister, had already delivered a similar message in person. He flew to Washington in January 2026 for private meetings with U.S. officials and conveyed the same position. The pressure wasn't coming from just one call. It was a coordinated campaign waged over weeks through multiple channels at the highest levels of two governments. This wasn't the first time Saudi Arabia played this role, and knowing the history makes the current revelation even more damning. In 2010, WikiLeaks published a massive trove of American diplomatic cables. Among them was a cable documenting the private advice that Saudi Arabia's late King Abdullah had given to American officials regarding Iran's nuclear program. King Abdullah told them to cut off the head of the snake. He wasn't speaking metaphorically about diplomacy. He was telling the United States to destroy Iran's government before it acquired nuclear weapons. That was 2010. 16 years later, his nephew MBS was delivering the same message to a different American president. The language had barely changed. There was also a darker layer to this story. A former senior American official, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, resigned from his position during this conflict. In his resignation letter, he stated that Trump had been deceived into attacking Iran. He placed responsibility on Israel in his public statement. But the broader picture, now emerging through multiple investigative reports, is that the deception, or the lobbying depending on your perspective, involved Saudi Arabia as deeply as it involved Israel. Two American allies, both operating publicly as advocates for peace, both privately pushing for war. Now look at what Saudi Arabia got from this war, and what it didn't expect. When the bombs started falling on Iran on February 28th, Riyadh was not celebrating publicly. It issued carefully worded statements. It said nothing to confirm or deny its role. It positioned itself as a concerned neighbor hoping for stability. Then Iran retaliated. Iran launched missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia. They struck Saudi energy facilities. Debris from intercepted ballistic missiles and drones damaged infrastructure across the kingdom. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry said it was assessing damage. The King Fahd Causeway, the major bridge connecting Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, was temporarily forced to close. Saudi Arabia's own THAAD radar defense systems in the region were targeted. Iran also closed the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is the artery through which Saudi oil flows to the world. Closing it didn't just hurt Iran, it throttled Saudi Arabia's own revenue stream. Oil prices globally surged 40%. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states collectively shut in an estimated 7.5 million barrels per day of crude oil production in March. The United States Energy Information Administration projected that figure would rise to 9.1 million barrels per day. MBS had told Trump the oil price spike would be temporary. It became one of the defining economic crises of 2026. And yet, even after Iranian missiles landed on Saudi soil, even after the strait closed, even after the energy facilities were damaged, MBS kept pushing. He kept calling. He kept urging Trump to prosecute the war harder, to not stop, to finish what had started. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states were privately telling American officials that a month of strikes had not weakened Tehran enough. They wanted more. They were reportedly considering whether to join the strikes themselves. That is the definition of a country that started something it now needed someone else to finish. Zoom out. Because the full picture of this story is about something larger than one prince and one president. The United States attacked Iran while nuclear negotiations were actively underway. Iran's foreign minister had said publicly, just days before the strikes, that a historic agreement was within reach. American and Iranian negotiators were preparing to meet in Geneva, led by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the American side. There was a real diplomatic process in motion. U.S. intelligence assessments reportedly concluded that Iran was not a direct threat to the American mainland within the next decade. There was no imminent attack on America. There was no intelligence suggesting American lives were in immediate danger. There was a nuclear negotiation that both sides publicly acknowledged was progressing. And then the bombs fell. Trump launched the largest American military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He did it while diplomacy was happening. He did it despite intelligence saying the threat was not imminent. He did it after weeks of private lobbying from Saudi Arabia and Israel. two governments whose interests in destroying Iran's military and political power were obvious, long-standing, and entirely separate from America's own national security calculus. The question that demands an answer is this: whose war was this? Saudi Arabia will not answer that question publicly. The kingdom's official position remains unchanged. It supports a peaceful resolution. It was not involved in pushing the United States toward military action. The private phone calls described by multiple officials with direct knowledge, those are denied. But the consequences are real and undeniable. Iran fired missiles at Saudi Arabia. Saudi energy infrastructure sustained damage. The Saudi economy took a hit from the strait closure. Saudi cities came under threat in ways they hadn't experienced in years. The blowback from the war that MBS reportedly encouraged has landed, at least partially, on Saudi soil. Meanwhile, MBS continues to call Trump, continues to push, continues to argue that the strikes have not gone far enough, that the war must continue until Iran's government is gone, that this is a historic opportunity that cannot be wasted. The man who reportedly started the fire is now telling the man with the hose to keep the flames burning. One thing has become impossible to deny. The story of how this war started, the version that describes America responding to an imminent Iranian threat, is incomplete. The fuller version includes a Saudi prince making call after call to an American president. It includes a Saudi defense minister flying to Washington in January to deliver the same message in person. It includes years of private Gulf lobbying for American military action against Iran, going back to at least 2010. It includes two governments publicly calling for peace while privately demanding war. It includes a resignation letter from a senior American official who said his own president was deceived. The bombs that fell on Iran on February 28th did not come from nowhere. They came from a decision. And that decision was shaped, significantly, demonstrably, according to multiple credible sources, by a phone call from a man who would never publicly admit it. Saudi Arabia begged Trump to attack Iran, and then Iran attacked Saudi Arabia back. That is the story nobody in Riyadh wants you to know. Now you do.